What would you tell your younger autistic self? This is a very loaded question for me, meaning I have a lot to say about that. I'll put the link in the description. It's really a well-written piece of information from those two female autistic authors. Messages for my younger autistic self. Things we wish we had known while growing up undiagnosed with autism. 1. There are some things that will never quite make sense to you. 2. Follow your own lead. 3. Pursue your passions. 4. There are people who understand. 5. You are autistic. Autism is interwoven throughout your every experience and underpins your ways of seeing, being, doing, and that is a beautiful thing. You see the world through an inherently autistic lens, which means you will see details that others miss. You will make connections that others can't fathom. You will experience intensity in ways that only an autistic mind can. It's important to honor rather than dismiss your way of being in the world. You may feel driven to stim, that is, to move your body in certain ways or make particular sounds or seek sensory input to regulate or express your emotions and feelings, both positive and negative. Similarly, you might find comfort in adjusting your environment to reduce sensory stimuli, for example, modify light or noise. You may prefer to communicate in text or writing or drawings rather than verbally. You may connect more deeply with people when the focus is on a shared interest or an activity. The lost generation, growing up with autism before the epidemic. Their autism unrecognized, they were sometimes regarded as willfully nonconformist, disruptive, or emotionally unstable. Some managed to earn stellar grades, while others muddled along academically, sometimes in special education classes, sometimes not. These are the lost generation, those who today would receive their diagnosis by 6 or 8 years old if they were a 21st century child, according to British researchers. Missed opportunities. A diagnosis can be bittersweet, bringing both relief as well as recognition of missed opportunities. Some members of the lost generation wondered if their lives would have been easier if they had been offered school services, social skills training, job programs geared to autism, or just plain understanding when they were younger. If there was the possibility to travel back in time, and do it all over again, it would be so completely different, very different. Why did nobody see this sooner? Why has it taken this long to know and understand? I am sure if I had been diagnosed much earlier, it would have spared me a lot of pain and feeling of not belonging. I think it would have changed everything. And I think from what I read we went into such a wrong direction with the Kanner autism. He led people astray because he was focusing on a different type of autism. Kanner, Asperger, and Frankel, a third influence at the genesis of the autism diagnosis. Autistic knowledge crossed the Atlantic to America with Georg and Annie Frankel, a previously unrecognized influence in the middle. The evidence presented here fills in many blanks and suggests that both Kanner and Asperger benefited from the Frankels' insight. They were a guiding force for both men, unseen until now because they left very little in the way of published papers. To the end of their lives, Kanner and Asperger described their conditions as separate and distinct. Today, they are both part of the autism spectrum in Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. This article explains how and why Kanner and Asperger saw their descriptions as different. It makes the case that Georg Frankl helped both men see autism as we know it today and first saw the breadth of that continuum. People have speculated for years about how Kanner and Asperger came to describe such similar conditions in 1943. Much of the recent talk has portrayed Kanner in a rather unflattering light. This new article in peer-reviewed journal Autism offers a new take and shows how both men had a mentor in the background. The differences between Kanner's autism and Asperger's diagnosis are also reviewed with what that means today. The Kanner autism. The Frankels ended up teaching in the psychology department at the University of Kansas, far from the central hub of autism research that Kanner's office became in the 1950s. As a result, Kanner was on his own as he formulated his conception of his syndrome. With the Frankels' departure, Kanner lost more than Georg and Annie's years of perspective on his patients as living examples of points on a broad continuum extending into adulthood. Autism was first named in 1943. Leo Kanner did a study of 11 children and found unusual things about them. He called it early infantile autism. By 1973, when Kanner finally admitted that autism might manifest itself in varying degrees of severity, this was already common knowledge in London. Lorna Wing was free of the heavy load of guilt that Kanner, Eisenberg, and Bettelheim laid on American parents. They had a whole different approach in Great Britain concerning autism, thanks to Lorna Wing. Lorna Gladys Wing, OBE, FRC Psych, was an English psychiatrist. She was a pioneer in the field of childhood development disorders who advanced understanding of autism worldwide, introduced the neutral term Asperger syndrome, and was involved in founding the National Autistic Society in the UK. In historical accounts of autism, American child psychologist Leo Kanner is a key player, but often for the wrong reasons. Credited for the first systematic description of autism in 1943, he also described the characteristics of parents of children he saw in his clinic. Against the backdrop of eugenics and psychoanalytical interpretations of behavioral conditions, his observations were taken as support for the idea that emotionally detached parents were in some way to blame for their child's autism, a notion popularized as the refrigerator mother theory. It was so popular, its specter continues to haunt parents today. That's a quote from Neurotribes, I think. When I read Kanner's later papers, Lorna Wing told me, I thought they were bloody stupid. I knew I wasn't a refrigerator mother. Kanner published his paper at a time when support for eugenic genetic engineering as a way to improve society was prevalent among scientists, making the diagnosis of innate condition a serious matter. This was a time in the United States when sterilization of people with intellectual disability was legal. Moreover, in 1942, Foster Kennedy, a prominent neurologist from New York, proposed a mercy death for children with severe intellectual disability. Bruno Bettelheim, who then directed the University of Chicago's Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School for Emotionally Disturbed Children, although he was an art historian by training, believed that autism wasn't innate, but rather the result of maternal aloofness. Blame it on the mother. The press and Bettelheim popularized the idea of a parent who displayed such emotional detachment as a refrigerator mother. Research at this time had shown that an extreme lack of social stimulation and emotional deprivation could severely affect development, which lent itself to the blame the parent theory of autism. The milder cases among the 200 children seen by Asperger in Vienna would likely have never made it to the top of Kanner's pyramid. What's more surprising is how far Kanner was willing to go to ensure that other researchers saw his syndrome as exceptionally rare and monolithic too, even after evidence to the contrary began to emerge. Though the spectrum model of autism and the concept of neurodiversity are widely believed to be products of our postmodern world, they turn out to be very old ideas proposed by Hans Asperger in his first public lecture on autism in 1938. Hans Asperger, he was the first to ever work with autistics long before the World War II started, but his research was lost through the war. And nobody wanted to be connected with anything that came out of the Nazi regime. Only later Hans Asperger's work was rediscovered. Kanner very well may have read Asperger's work, but kept it a secret. Kanner made his syndrome a source of shame and stigma for families worldwide, while sending autism research off in the wrong direction for decades. Quote from Neurotribes: I never met Hans Asperger, but have great respect for his understanding and admiration of a distinct group of children who are also my heroes. A few years ago, I met his daughter Maria Asperger-Felder, a child psychiatrist in Switzerland, and I was entranced by her stories about her father, his abilities and personality, but particularly his circumstances in which he worked in Vienna in the late 1930s. Maria gave me one of her father's papers, published in 1938, when he first described the characteristics that several years later became known as autistic personality disorder, and eventually Asperger's syndrome in 1981. As a pediatrician in Nazi-occupied Austria, he was bravely arguing against the recently introduced law for the prevention of offspring suffering from hereditary diseases. He advocated that education will render harmless the dangers which are in a child's genetic disposition. He wanted to save the children at his clinic from being murdered, and vehemently argued that children who are unusual are not necessarily inferior. He was clearly an opponent of Nazism. When Asperger submitted his thesis to Hamburger in 1943, the University of Vienna was a mockery of the prestigious center of learning that it had been 5 years earlier. Of the nearly 200 senior members of the medical faculty, fewer than 50 remained, and their replacements were bumbling fanatics. Asperger's colleagues, Annie Weiss and Georg Frankl, had been forced to flee the country, and many of the other former faculty were in exile, imprisoned in concentration camps, or dead of suicide. The beautiful city of Vienna had become an abattoir of surreal brutality. Asperger was speaking out with the force of his whole personality, for the sake of children all over Europe who had not yet been murdered by a monstrous idea of human perfectibility, an idea that his supervisors, who were fervent Nazis, had imported from America. When Asperger's thesis finally appeared in print a year later, his clinic lay in ruins. He also lost the prescient Viennese view of the eccentricities of their parents and relatives. Where Asperger and his colleagues recognized a specialized form of intelligence, systematically acquiring data in a confusing world, Kanner saw a desperate bid for parental affection. Where Asperger saw threads of genius and disability inextricably intertwined in his patients' family histories, testifying to the complex genetic roots of their condition and the social value of his personality type, as he put it, Kanner saw the shadow of the sinister figure that would become infamous in popular culture as the refrigerator mother. In 1972, the Society launched Somerset House, the first residential facility and school in Europe for autistic adults. Elgar and her husband moved into a flat on the top floor. These achievements put Lorna and her professional colleagues light years ahead of their American peers in their understanding of autism. Researchers would eventually discover that autistic people stim to reduce anxiety, and also simply because it feels good. In fact, harmless forms of self-stimulation, like flapping and fidgeting, may facilitate learning by freeing up executive functioning resources in the brain that would otherwise be devoted to suppressing them. The intense world syndrome interpretation of autism suggests that the autistic person may perceive his or her surroundings as overwhelmingly intense due to hyperreactivity of primary sensory areas, and aversive and highly stressful due to hyperreactive amygdala, which makes quick and powerful fear associations with usually neutral stimuli. Impaired social interactions and withdrawal are thus seen as the consequences and not the core features of autism. Unlike normal people at the stage of sensation, many autistic individuals perceive everything without filtration and selection and experience the difficulty of distinguishing between foreground and background sensory stimuli. Olga Bogdashina. Asperger emphasized the stability of the clinical picture throughout childhood, adolescence, and at least into early adult life, apart from the increase in skills brought upon by maturation. The major characteristics appear to be impervious to the effects of environment and education. He considered the social prognosis to be generally good, meaning that most developed far enough to be able to use their special skills to obtain employment. He also observed that some who had especially high levels of ability in the area of their special interests were able to follow careers in, for example, science and mathematics. However, clinically diagnosable anxiety and varying degrees of depression may be found, especially in late adolescence or early adult life, which seem to be related to a painful awareness of handicap and difference from other people. Newly diagnosed adults were engaged in a very different conversation about the difficulties of navigating and surviving in a world not built for them. By sharing their stories of their lives, they discovered that many of the challenges they face daily are not symptoms of their autism, but hardships imposed by a society that refuses to make basic accommodation for people with cognitive disabilities as it does for people with physical disabilities such as blindness or deafness. In a social model, disability happens when the environment doesn't cater for our individual characteristics. In the social model, we don't refer to people with disability. Disability is not something we carry around like luggage. Instead, we use the word disabled as a verb. Disability is something that's being done to me. I am actively being disabled by the society around me. When we feel overwhelmed, this is not something that is wrong with us, but struggle because our environment doesn't cater to our needs. If our environment was designed in a way that fits our needs, we still would be autistic, but we no longer would be disabled by our environment. An autistic friend mentioned the lost generation to me. I felt if I had known about being autistic some decades earlier, maybe things would have been different. Less painful, less difficult, or at least with more support and less trauma. Quote, sensory information seems to come to the autistic individual in infinite detail and holistically, that is, all at once. It is often hard for the autistic person to integrate what they are experiencing into separate and unique entities. Also, they are very sensitive to many stimuli that most people ignore. Since the parents are usually not autistic, they are often of little help to the autistic child in sorting out sensory information and making sense of the world. This is the first step that begins the loneliness that most autistic people feel for much of their life. No one with normal perception could guess that their eyes, for example, pick up very different signals from light, shade, color, and movement than autistic individuals do. The first realization of their difficulties usually comes for autistic individuals in the late teens or even later. This is a great book by Gordon Gates, Trauma, Stigma, and Autism, written by an autistic person. I was born in 1974, started school in 1981 in a village, so it was very common school settings and nobody had ever heard about autism back then. So I was severely misunderstood by my parents, my teachers, and my schoolmates. Sarah Hendricks is a woman who lectures on ASD, and she was diagnosed at age 49. She referred to undiagnosed folks as feral cats, turning up as a bit frayed and scraggly. Getting a diagnosis for autism is something very important. My autism might have been spotted earlier, and I was denied the help and support I needed. I am a cat, judging myself by dog behavior. It was doomed to failure. I would have handled things differently. I could have explained myself. People would have understood me. I could have been protected. Professor Tony Attwood summed it up well. People with Asperger's or autism expend a huge amount of mental energy each day coping with socializing, anxiety, change, sensory sensitivity, daily living skills, and so on. So they're actually expending more mental energy. Think of it as an energy bank account. They are withdrawing so much energy throughout the day just by surviving. For Tony Attwood, late diagnosis for girls and women usually means a greater number of issues later in life. Those diagnosed late or in adulthood have worse outcomes. They didn't get support and understanding at a formative time in their lives. What concerns me is that they created a scaffolding to survive, but that it may not have been the best approach, and that sometimes that scaffolding has led to all sorts of issues and concerns, such as depression, low self-esteem, and not having an anchor in society. Getting a diagnosis and access to services needed is like coming ashore after a life of bobbing up and down in a sea that seemed to stretch to infinity in all directions. It may come as a kind of revelation, as well as a blessed relief, when they learn that their sensory problems are not the result of their weakness or lack of character. The idea of neurodiversity has inspired the creation of a rapidly growing civil rights movement based on the simple idea that the most astute interpreters of autistic behavior are autistic people themselves, rather than their parents or doctors. Who among us does not recognize the autistic scientist whose clumsiness have made him a familiar caricature, but who is capable of extraordinary accomplishments in a highly specialized field? Hans Asperger.